Good evening, Rick. I'm Andrew Kreig, as you know, and we're broadcasting by Zoom here from Washington and Alabama, the 4th District in Alabama. And I'm just delighted to have a chance to visit with you and talk about the campaign and your views for what's needed. So thank you for joining.
Thank you, Andrew, and I appreciate very much having a conversation with you again. The last time we talked, it was quite wonderful. And my name is Rick Neighbors, Democratic nominee for the 4th Congressional District of Alabama.
Well, that time we spoke before, we were talking about the prison situation in Alabama, but just to place this conversation that we're about to have a little bit in time and place, let me say that most of the listeners are already familiar with you and your campaign, so I'll just mention briefly what prompted me to seek this interview with you. I'm a longtime reporter based in Washington, D.C., right on Pennsylvania Avenue, halfway between Congress and the White House. And I became familiar with some aspects of Alabama in reporting on various issues about a decade ago, including the Don Siegelman case, the Milton McGregor case, and various other political events in Alabama. So I've since followed a situation, and your candidacy strikes me as quite interesting, and I'd like to ask some questions about your plans and hopes and how things are going, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, to begin with, most of the listeners know about the 4th District, which stretches across the state, avoiding most of the major large metro areas, aside perhaps from Gadsden. But could you describe the district and its voters and population?
Yeah, it's a little over 680,000 people. It's 67% rural. It's 85% white, 7% African American, 5% Hispanic, and a few percent is Asian and Native Americans. But we're primarily a rural district. Average medium household income is about $42,000 a year, 42, 43, which means 2 people working for $10.50 an hour. Until COVID, the average wage in this district was a little over $12.50 an hour. It's since gone up in many places, not in all, but in many places due to COVID, they've increased wages about $1, $1.25 an hour, which still puts them right at the poverty level for a household of 4 for 1 worker.
And what's your own personal background? I know you were a veteran during the Vietnam War, or you served during the Vietnam War. You're a veteran now, but what part of the district have you been living in, and what sort of things have you been doing?
I think I grew up in North Carolina. My father served in the service and in the military, both World War I and World War II in Korea. We were sharecroppers. I dropped out of school, went in the Army at 17, spent 7 years, got out, bummed around a year, and went to school under the GI Bill. On graduation, I still did not know what I wanted to do, and I took a temporary job, and that temporary job lasted over 30 years. And that work was in the apparel, the apparel industry, cutting and sewing. And I was around to see not only his growth where people could make middle income wages in the 80s, unskilled, untrained, come in, learn a job, learn it well, work their behinds off and earn a middle income wage. And I saw that go away. In that process, was assigned to Alabama, a place called Hackeberg. And there I met my wife, and we married in 1981. She wasn't leaving, and I wasn't leaving without her. So this has been my home in northwest Alabama since 1980. And we've traveled with apparel, both throughout the states and to Dominican and Mexico. And when all that left, we came back here, and I work now in the food processing industries.
And what type of food? Of course, your district is very heavily agricultural. So what type of food are you focused on?
Poultry processing is a huge part of our agricultural base. In fact, at one point, we were the second largest or the third largest poultry processing growing congressional district in the nation. There was one over in Arkansas that was larger than this particular district. But the poultry processing grain is a huge industry in this district. But the biggest employer is our services, and our teachers and medical staff and government employees are the largest employers combined.
And how would you categorize those specific government sectors? What do they do?
Well, they have, USDA has a great deal of folks in the poultry processing plants. Then you have the military bases, but mainly they're your state workers, your teachers and your nurses and your home health care workers. Because again, we are very rural, very poor. And when you've got these conditions, we pay for people to take care of them.
And how has your focus on these private concerns, both in your community and more generally through the district, led you to run for office?
I grew up for people who go out and work every day. They work hard and come home, and they should have a living wage. And I said earlier, in 1980, a sewing operator can make $10 an hour, which is the equivalent of $67,000 a year today. Untrained, unskilled. We have college grads that come out of school, and they're lucky if they can find something in this area at 42 to 45,000. This district is losing 5% of our population a year because the best and brightest leave because they cannot make a living wage here. The industries that our political leaders are trying to attract are not industries that people can make a living at. We had a cost.
Are you talking about poultry or other jobs? No,
most every one of them we're attracting. We are attracting the industry, the mature industries that are their life cycle, if you will, of those products are coming to an end, and they're paying low wages. They're moving out of more higher wage locations to low wage locations. We get governors and state legislatures and congressional legislators, come to the South because we will work cheap. A case in point was Boeing a few years ago, you may remember, was trying to move to South Carolina. South Carolina says, come on here, we'll pay you $13 an hour. If you work real good and be nice, in a little while, well, you can earn $15 an hour, which was good for South Carolina because their wage at that time was somewhere around $10, $50, $11 an hour. But they were going to give Boeing money to come here because their people would work cheap, and that's how they sold it. That's how it's been sold in Alabama. But fortunately, the workers in Washington says, if you want to build that plant in South Carolina, have at it, we won't go to work. But they needed them to finish those planes to fund to move their jobs offshore, to South Carolina. And when the workers walked off, they kept building the planes in Washington. And that's an example of what's going on today. The jobs that we are recruiting generally are jobs that pay much lower wages and they're coming from higher wage areas to a low wage area because our politicians are selling our labor as being cheap. And that's not right. Our people are not cheap. They're good people. They work hard. They need to be paid what they're worth.
Well, let's dig deeper here. And why are the politicians doing that?
To get reelected.
Well,
because they don't know.
Wouldn't you think they'd get reelected if they did good things for the voters?
Oh, I think for the last 40 years, they're working, especially in the rural South, and especially in this area that in the 4th District, we've not attracted good high-paying jobs. We have one of the highest rates of deaths due to despair, which is drug, suicide, and alcoholism. We are having to try to recruit math teachers from other countries because we're not graduating students that are motivated to learn these skills that will come into our classrooms. We're not attracting industry because we're not building the skill sets in our public schools to attract these industries, so they're going elsewhere. So these politicians say, well, I'll bring something. Something is the argument that something is worth than nothing, and I argue, no, that is not true, because if you're offering someone a half a loaf and they need a loaf to feed their family, they're still hungry.
Well, let's dig even deeper. So these are obvious problems. They've lasted a while in the district, or they wouldn't be so serious. What is it that you can bring to solutions of let's start with this problem that other people can't when it's a long-term problem? And let's also say that while we might, it's a two-pronged question. What gives you the capability and vision to do something about it? And second, what can a member of Congress do?
Well, I consider myself a problem solver. If you see something, find the root cause, look around for solutions, and then attract people to get those implemented. Case in point, in 2010, came across a program to build, a gentleman wanted to build compact fluorescent lights in the US. I worked out a plan at 400 operators at $20 an hour. I could not get to the gatekeeper to get a phone call. Hey, bring this, we want to bring this factory here to Alabama. I sent this stuff to Adderholt. I said, Adderholt, make a phone call, make sure this is a legit deal, and we'll raise the funds to build this factory. Adderholt wouldn't make the phone call. This year, when this issue with PPE and masks, we had volunteers that started sewing masks to fill the short-term need. We knew that was not sustainable. We located equipment and materials, and we could have set up a plant in the 4th Congressional District, making $2.5 million masks a week. Again, it was the issue of funding. It was sent to the Economic Development Councils, sent to the governor's office, sent to Washington, D.C. I said, folks, here's a plan. We need masks. If our people need masks, we can build the masks. It's going to cost $2.5 million to do it. Let's get it done. Only thing we got was press releases and speeches. And now that equipment is over 6 months delivery if we wanted to build it. So this is what I do. We got a problem. Let's go find it. Let's go build it. And let's go do it. That's what I bring. That's my background. Now, being as a congressman, what you get is a microphone. And I understand that. You get a place to raise an issue and raise the awareness. Folks, if we got these issues, we can solve that. We got Bishop Mountain still doesn't have potable water. They were told 3 years ago they would run a water line. Idaho told them that, said the money was there. You got Detroit in Lamar County. It's got, unless it fixes its water problem or someone comes up with a way to fund that project, you got a community that's not going to lose its potable water.
Well, let me ask you, if the solution is that obvious, why won't, in your view, Congressman Adderholt do something about it? My understanding is he was elected to Congress in 1996. He's been around longer than most people. He's on the Appropriations Committee as one of the most senior 3 people in the Republican minority there. He's chairman of a important committee on a subcommittee on commerce, justice, science, and related agencies. And he's prominent on the agriculture subcommittee. Why won't he do these things if it's fairly simple and he's got the seniority to get things done?
Because he doesn't live here. He owns a house here. He doesn't live here. He doesn't know this community. Now, he knows about Bishop Mountain because he told them in 2017 the funds were there. He doesn't know the people in Detroit. He comes here during election cycle, has an ice cream party on his lawn, on his house in Haleyville. He will come for some kind of event occasionally. He doesn't live here. None of his kids go to school here. He has no idea what these people go through. He's totally disconnected from the working men and women of this district.
Well, my understanding, he lives in Northern Virginia, and you're saying his kids have gone to school there for a long time. Is that correct?
None of his kids have gone to Alabama public schools, except this year, my understanding, one of his daughters had been accepted into Auburn. But as far as K through 12, none of his kids went to public schools. And that's why he doesn't know that in this rural district, we have schools with 20-year-old textbooks. That we have, I have a great granddaughter that's using the same book that her father had when he went to the same school.
My gosh.
And that's terrible. And then we're talking about broadband. If we want rural Alabama to survive, to thrive, you have to hook up the rural broadband. He talks about rural broadband every election cycle. Yes, I understand we got some funds to the USDA to run some broadband cable, optic cable through certain urban areas. But that's not enough. We have to create, in the 21st century, we have to treat broadband like we did the Rural Electrification Act of the 1930s. It's essential. It's essential for the 21st century. And that means we got to run cable to the last house at the end of the longest road. Do it. Get it done. If you go back how they funded the RAA project, that can also be funded with broadband, and we could take this on not only as a district, but also as a nation. It's where we will have to go if we're going to be competitive in the 21st century. And it's time to quit talking about it and doing it. Now, I recognize you've got to get the Congress involved, but we've got to do something. Our elected officials have got to do something other than just trying to get reelected.
Well, I'll just add as a point, I've had about 4 or 5 careers, and one of them was as vice president and then president of something called the Wireless Communications Association before I returned to my original position as a reporter and attorney. But for 15 years, we were trying this from, let's say, 1993 to 2008. We were trying to develop wireless broadband at a time when the only internet was through wires. And we ultimately helped succeed. But as a result, I've followed the Federal Communications Commission, the Department of Agriculture's rural programs. And so out of that, I got a tough question for you. It's often a lot easier to talk about giving broadband to rural communities than to do it, because the problem is whether you're doing cable or wireless or even satellite, it's expensive to reach disconnected communities, and it costs money. And the question is, who's going to pay for it? Now, your opponent, Congressman Adderholt, one of his main themes is he doesn't like for the government to spend money. And that's worked for him. My understanding is that he won the last election with 80% of the vote.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're basically making an argument that this very popular congressman, whose position is let's not spend any money on these people in the district, and what makes you think that people who voted for him last time, 80%, aren't really happy with a view that he's got, which is let's not spend any money?
Well, there's a couple of issues there. First of all, him not spending any money. That's not true. Before they stopped pork barreling, I can tell you this is, and it's in his record, when he was sitting on Ways and Means Committee, he penciled in several millions of dollars for a firm to develop an aerial RPG introduction device. And basically that was a helicopter on a field of battle where an RPG has been, a rocket propelled grenade is being used. They would detect a launch, swoop down on a helicopter and drop a chain link fence and capture that in mid-flight. That was the plan. And I think it was $20 million he penciled in for a contractor, of course, that donated generously to his campaign. Of course, it's a foolish idea, and any basic trainee, first 2 weeks of basic, we know it's a foolish idea. And that was wasted dollars. But we go back to Rural Electrification Act. That was a case where you had electricity in high density populated areas. Private companies would go in because of the density population, how many houses per mile of cable, they could make a profit off that. Well, in rural areas, and we're 66, 67% rural, you don't have that density population. Therefore, it would be cost prohibitive to pay a user fee for, people wouldn't pay it because the user fee would be too expensive. So the way that was handled in the 30s, they've got, rather than look at a short-term 2, 3 year, 4 year payback on that loan, they went to private lenders and let's look at a 20, 30, 40 year plan on money that is collected through the taxes and through the user fees that pays that back. And that is how we've got electricity to every house in this country. So you can't use the same economic strategies you would for private industry when you're serving the public. But you've got to be thoughtful about that. You've got to be prudent about that. And you got to have a stable plan that people who you borrow the money from, that you can pay that back at a reasonable rate, not 15 and 20%, but a sustainable rate. And that way you're investing in your community, your neighborhood, and you are allowing them an opportunity to participate in the 21st century.
Well, here's a similar issue, and please tell me if what your voters there in the 4th District think about this ongoing plan to gut the U.S. Postal Service. And, what's getting the headlines is the likelihood that they're going to delay vote by mail. But, you dig down underneath and you find that the deliveries of medicine are delayed, checks to veterans, checks to Social Security people. And if you dig deeper, as I have, I run the Justice Integrity Project here in Washington, an investigative reporting organization. And we look into it, and it's not just a temporary thing. In our view, it's a long-term plan to privatize the Postal Service, break the union that's part of it, and turn over package and postal deliveries to for-profit organizations like Federal Express that, of course, are going to charge much higher for rural delivery. And in fact, it's amazing. They're already out with their plans to really charge people in Alaska a lot more because it's so spread out, and it doesn't get any headlines. But how do your voters there feel about targeting the Postal Service and making them pay more in the long run because they live scattered addresses?
As far as how they feel, I think with most of the, as you just said, it's not a big headline item because there's so much drama we're currently going through with COVID, with what's going on with the presidential races, schools. It has not got the reflection, I don't believe, that it deserves. Now, of course, folks know in our articles, in our Constitution, required a postal roads. Postal Service is the only federal institution, only government institution that touches every house in this nation. It is required by law currently to do that.
Well, it's got enemies because your average postal customer doesn't make that many donations. They're just buying the stamps.
Well, but
where you get the lobbyists for the profit companies, for-profit companies, they can make the big donations and help change.
Well, you've got, yeah, there were several issues on just the finance side of that. The internet, what we're using now, has replaced sending letters. Therefore, that cuts into the revenue. For people who have internet service and they can send an email rather than a postal letter.
Well, here's
in rural communities.
Yeah.
You still got to have that post office in the rural communities, and these rural communities is sometimes that postal service is their only contact with the broader world is through that mail carrier. There's something governments do that private industry can't. Private industry is there to make a profit. They have a private service and they sell that and you pay them and they go about their business. But the government is there to serve the people. It's not about whether they're making a profit or not. Now, should we be wasteful of that money? No, of course not. But you can, if you look at these postal service, it's a network to tie our nation together. It helped form our value system, our culture, and only because you had that mail carrier that went to these places and we were able to correspond.
Well, it's right there in the Constitution. Ben Franklin made sure that it was one of the few businesses that's mentioned specifically in the Constitution as deserving of notice and support. Another one where I began my career is the newspaper business. And a few moments ago, we talked about getting headlines. Well, part of the problem is newspapers, including in Alabama, are in terrible financial shape, partly because of the internet. And I believe some of the major cities have gone to just publishing the daily newspapers in Alabama just a few days a week, not daily. And so Actually, I was just looking at the alumni section earlier today of a newspaper where I spent 14 years, and it's really a lot of sad stories. It's in another state. It's the oldest newspaper in America, Richmond Current in Connecticut. And it's just terrible what reporters are going through with all the cutbacks. But you're running for office, you're looking for news coverage, but there's very few newspapers that have staff that can afford to cover the news. So what do you do to get your message out?
Well, and you take on that in this campaign with COVID, you got several areas. Yeah, you've got the newspapers are going away, the reporters are going away. We're consolidating our media, TV stations, both cable, where you used to have you can only own 2 or 3 newspapers and TVs. Now you can own as many as you want, and that is why I think we have resulted in so much polarization with news media, because you're mainly just getting one or two stories, 1 or 2 or 3 views of the world, where 40, 50 years ago, you were getting different views, different opinions almost in every county. And that made for a diverse conversations, and people would then have to learn and become knowledgeable about the issues that were going on around them. We don't have that anymore. We just CNN says this, or Fox says this, or MSNBC says that. And that, in many cases, is the extent of our information, and whatever's on Facebook, we'll read those articles. I think that's very unfortunate.
Well, it does create the polarization, the tribal rivalries, where people have trouble thinking of the facts, as opposed to just looking for information that helps their predetermined position. There's a great quote I encountered, and I wish I could think of who said it, but it was probably somebody like Mark Twain. And he said, the media can't tell you what to think, but they can tell you what to think about. And if they are constantly pointing at a theme, you may have contrary views, but you're thinking about it, when by reality, a lot of these topics that I encounter in Washington and elsewhere are not that important, but we're made to focus on it quite a bit. Well, let me move to another kind of hot topic these days. And this is even more hot button. But we now have a president who's maybe not quite getting the vote numbers of your rival, at least in the past, but he did pretty well in Alabama, and we're having some revelations from various people on various topics, and the big one last week was that he's privately telling generals and others that veterans are suckers, they're losers, and particularly if they get killed or captured, why would anybody do that? And he doesn't want anybody who's missing an arm or a leg marching in a veterans parade, because he thinks it's not a good look. How's that going over? First with you, but you got a lot of veterans in the 4th District. Do you get any feedback yet, or are the loyalties just ironclad for President Trump?
I find the president's words disheartening. My father served, as I said, in World War II in Korea, my uncles. I served in Vietnam, my brother, my cousin. I go to the wall. I've been to the wall on several occasions in Washington, the Vietnam Memorial. And I've looked those names up on the wall, the men that I served with and I knew. And none of them are losers and suckers. How dare he speak of the people who defined our nation that way?
Well, because he's done things like that for a long time. Of course, he got deferments on bone spurs, and one of the books that came out said he can't even remember which foot it was supposed to be because his wealthy father bribed a doctor to write it up during Vietnam era.
We all know it was just a rich guy paying off because he didn't want to do something.
Well, we have other problems, and this week we've got a pretty amazing situation where he gave 18 interviews to Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, and the first tidbit, which is not that small, is we're hearing two things. That President Trump knew as early as January and February that the COVID disease was very serious and that he didn't want to talk about it because he didn't want to get people upset. So he told people that it's not that serious. The other thing is we find that Woodward taped the recordings. Now, Woodward's book is officially coming out next week, but the speculation is that he tape recorded all 18 of these conversations with Donald Trump's permission, which raises a certain question aside from the content of the judgment, where you would talk to Woodward and voluntarily let him tape you if you have things like this to say. So that's kind of a long buildup. Let me break it down. We're about to pass 200,000 dead in this country. It's over 190,000 now, over 6 million sick. President Trump said the end of February publicly that only about 15 people had the disease in the US, and he expected it to go away in a few days. We've now got 200,000 dead. There are projections from the University of Washington that'll be 400,000 dead by December 1st or so, maybe higher, maybe slightly lower, depending on what kind of prevention there is. How do you feel about that? And how do you feel about, let's say, Congressman Adderholt's activity? You've done what you can to create mass through your campaign, but how do you feel big picture about how our prevention is going? How do you feel about President Trump's comments that are apparently on tape? And third, how do you feel about your rivals' public positions on this?
If a military officer intentionally, knowingly subjected their soldiers under them to death, he would have been court-martialed, brought up on charges, maybe even given the death penalty for such a blatant disregard and incompetence.
Well, if it's one person and a lower ranking person, the public can focus on it. If it's 200,000, isn't the natural reaction to say, well, it is what it is as president?
No, I think during the Nuremberg trials, they call them crimes against humanity, did they not?
That's correct.
Now,
Well,
as far as my impotent, and again, he doesn't know this district. He doesn't know what's going on here. And quite frankly, I don't think he cares.
is he a
As long
veteran?
as he gets reelected.
Is he a veteran?
No.
Well, there are so many big issues, but another one is President Trump really wants to cut the payroll tax, and that would give a 6.5% boost in the income to people who are currently working. And that would help in the short run, because people would say, well, we don't mind that we're not getting any extra on unemployment, but we've got this extra 6%. But the problem with that is that 6.5% helps fund Social Security and Medicare. And the predictions are, if that 6.5% goes away, we could have very serious problems as soon as 2023, that's just 2.5 years from now, where people might not be able to get their Social Security and Medicare. How do you feel about a short run goose to those who are working that helps in this election cycle, if it means that old people and people who need Medicare may have to do without very soon?
I think it's absolutely nonsense. Come on, folks. This is the Social Security. This is the funds that my parents live on, from people my age live on. So we want to say, we want to stop paying into the system that these folks have paid in all their life. All their life they played into that. And yes, it requires those coming behind to pay into that system too. And we're going to do that for what? For what? You're going to save $50 and then you're going to take the risk of putting millions of people go hungry, can't pay the old folks. In this particular district, there's 180,000 people on Social Security, and 67% of those are the elderly. This is a farce. It is a pretension that we're doing something good when we do absolutely nothing but except create misery.
Well, let me add a little context that's, to keep my question short, I made it simple, but there's another element to this. Some of the people who want to undertake this plan to cut down on Social Security, one of their motives or arguments is they say, well, why don't we put this Social Security money and planning in the hands of very smart people on Wall Street, and they can use this money and make it much, much bigger, because they know, for lack of a better term, the art of the deal. And they will take this program and make investments that are very smart and build up that money if you only trust them to make the right decision.
There's a
you
couple
think
of
of that?
fallacies for that argument. Number one, 87% of all the transactions on Wall Street are made by computers and algorithms, not by people. People need to understand that. And what does that mean? That means somebody gets up today and says, oh, I feel good. Yeah, let's go make the stock go up. And someone says, oh, I didn't get my coffee this morning and the stock goes down. If you recall, just a few months ago when COVID went home, it dropped. And we send out money on the CARES Act, and the people who are selling products, making products, oh, it's not hurting me at all. And therefore, the stock came back up. The movement of the stock market does not impact the people in the 4th Congressional District who's living on Social Security. Not one bit whatsoever. Most of those stocks are owned by very few people. If
Well,
we think the stock market is so good, then I remind you folks again about the 2007-2008 financial crisis. I know people who lost all their life savings in that. Absolutely not. I want to put my good faith in the good faith of people of this nation living in Social Security, and you don't speculate that, you don't gamble with that in the stock market. Leave it where it is.
well, thank you for that. I'm sure we could go on, and I hope we have a chance to visit again on these important issues. I will close with one that's probably not going to get you many votes because prisoners are not popular people. But there was an interesting story, and I believe you know about it, a series of long articles in the New York Times about the Alabama prison system. And I know that you've taken an interest in injustice, in conditions. Your state is famous for tough on crime, tough on prisoners. I will say, though, it's interesting that some of the leaders, like Mike Hubbard and some others in the legislature, had to leave early because of crime. But to get to the point, this is an issue that's attracting not simply nationwide attention in the New York Times, but for the Justice Integrity Project, I was looking for a good picture on the internet of a young Alabama man. I believe his last name was Rust, or maybe Randy Rust, and he was a prisoner who was being constantly threatened by gangs in prison, and his parents had to keep paying money to these criminals, or they'd threaten to beat him up. And I was looking for a good picture of him, and I found a great picture, and it happened to be in a newspaper in Bangladesh, one of the poorest parts of the world. It's over, as you know, on the shores. It's part of the Indian subcontinent, and just, you know, very impoverished place. And they reran this New York Times story, and they had a nice picture of this young white man who was just living an awful existence in the Alabama prison system. So you never know who's going to be interested in what story, but Alabama has gotten notorious for its prison system. And what might you say about that? I'm sure the people in your district are law-abiding, and maybe most of them are inclined to think people deserve what they get if they're in prison, but probably not everybody. What do you think?
I think we don't need more prisons, we need less prisoners. One of the issues that in February, I was at a conference or a meeting, and you had these several candidates running for district judges. One lady spoke about a program she was working on with 8 and 9-year-old kids, an intervention program, so that when they got older, they wouldn't end up in that prison pipeline, and talking about the success they were having that. You had another judge who was running for re-election. He said that he was thinking about giving longer prison sentences because primarily young black men would come in, get in trouble. They had no skills and no training. They would get in trouble. He would send them to jail, to prison. They would get out on an early out for good behavior. They had no skills, no training, couldn't get a job. They get back in trouble. They come before him. They give them another sentence. They go to jail, get out on good behavior, no job, no skills, get in trouble, and he keep repeating this cycle. Now he was frustrated, but he said the only tool that he could stop this recidivism rate was just give them longer sentences. And I'm sitting there, my mind agape, and I think it's that's how you don't solve the same problem with the same thinking that created it. The problem is not prison sentences. The problem is lack of skills, lack of jobs, and lack of opportunities for hope. We address those, then we will solve this prison pipeline and we will reduce the need for these prisons. And what does that mean? You got to start in reinvesting, fully funding our public education systems. We don't need people in Montgomery nor people in Washington to tell them that classroom what is best for that child. The person who knows best for that child is that classroom teacher. Let them do their job. They're well trained. We need to well pay them for that, and we need to fund them with the resources so our children will have an opportunity to succeed as adults in this country. That's where we start there. And then for crying out loud, we have some people that have difficulties and they need mental health assistance, not a prison cell. And because we shut down the mental health deals, so what do we do? I understand the frustration. I understood the frustration of this judge that was saying the only thing he needed to do was give longer sentences. But that's not the problem. To find the root cause and then deal with the root cause, and then we won't need these prisons because we will have less prisoners. Yes, that's a pie in the sky, folks. That's the truth. Beating people up, taking away people's liberty is not going to solve this problem because they still have no skills and no job. Until we address those, when we address those, then we'll address this problem. And the problem exists not because of people bad, but because we have failed people in our communities. That's why we have this problem.
Well, that seems like a very fitting way to end this interview. I know your time is valuable, and the listeners like to hear things in shorter segments. I used to host a radio show for 7 years. It's called Washington Update, and it had some tremendous thinkers, public officials, authors, and certainly your comments are in that tradition. And maybe we'll restart it more formally. But for now, I want to thank you for being my guest on this segment here, and hope to talk to you again on another occasion. And there's much more to talk about.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me, and my pleasure being here.
It's my pleasure too.